Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another alternate history Hearts of Iron 4 video. One in which I feel like I've disappointed all of you, because at this point, for any of you who voted in the last poll, you're probably wondering, hey Stack, why don't you have Millennium Dawn up on the screen? After all, that's what we voted for. 50% of the vote. What if NATO had fought against Russia after Crimea in 2014 with Nil Dawn? Guys, I'm telling you this right now. Look, I'm apologizing. I am apologizing. I tried. I really did try to set all this up. But unfortunately, when it comes to a lot of the modern day mods, they start in two time periods. They start in 2000 or 2016. And actually, a third one, they start in maybe 2020. Typically, or 20, it really just depends on what it is that we're looking at. But either way, you never get a good start date to actually work with something that begins in 2014, to the point that every single thing that I looked at doing, I would have to play the game for a whopping 10 or 12 hours just to get to the point that I could start the video in the first place. And I don't have that kind of time. If we want things to take place like that here in the future, then I can, technically speaking, do it, but the effort that has to go into making said video is simply not worth it with the time that I have to invest when there's many other projects that I have to do. So if the videos, and this is going to sound bad of me, performed significantly better, then yeah, it would be more worth it. But the amount that would take is kind of the offset of like 3 or 4 other regular videos, because it would take me the time that I would need to make 3 or 4 regular videos just to make that one. So as a result, I am sorry, but we are going to be going with second place. What if the Nordic countries had formed their own defensive faction? Spoiler alert, if it's just that, it's not really going to change much. But interpreted differently, well, what if it was successful? How would that be the case? Also, remember as we jump into this to give your suggestions for future alternate history scenarios down in the comment section below. The top 4 most liked scenarios get put into a poll for you all to vote on, which normally we choose the result from the winner. You know, that's usually how it goes. Again, I know it sounds bad of me saying this considering what we've already now done, but that is how it usually plays out. So here it is then, my friends, January of 1936, and we have the Nordic countries, none of which are doing really well right now. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, all of them are in pretty tough positions economically, sort of socially as well, and especially militarily. Oh dear God, it's not great at all. The only one that has any kind of degree of preparedness in this is Finland, and even then, it's obviously not an economic powerhouse. What is interesting when you look at Hearts of Iron 4, though, is that every single one of these nations is able to form the Nordic Council. That is something that they can do. They can create a defensive alliance amongst themselves. However, what is the nation that is most realistically going to do this? There's 2 possibilities I see. Finland had a little bit more of an independent streak, and while it is that we could change some things for them to want to work with the other countries to a greater degree, it doesn't really make as much sense to do Finland. Denmark, on the other hand, over here, yeah, it's also in a absolutely terrible position. It lost a lot of territory over the course of the 19th century and was severely weakened militarily and economically over the course of the decades, to the point that Germany was able to invade and take it over in a matter of 6 hours, which the whole point of invading Denmark was to use it as a staging operation to invade Norway, and that's where we get our real 2 contenders. You have Norway and you have Sweden, both of which are economically more powerful than the other states, we can say, but Norway is in a very rough position economically, even though it serves as a very good merchant fleet creator and transporter. It has a number of decent industries. Sweden has a lot in the way of iron and resources that it is a key component of the German war machine, and so really either one of these 2 options could be who you have form the Nordic Council. But in terms of one that is more likely to get involved and actually do something in the beginning, I honestly would go with Norway. And there's a very key reason why. Norway in 1936 is suffering from many issues. Its fortifications are crumbling. Yeah, it's going to have some communist problems, but it's not just communist problems. It has communist, fascist, and everything in between issues, because a series of governments, I think like 9 in the span of just 2 decades, would end up ruling Norway. And what would happen with that is that it was constantly changing every 18 months or so to a new type of government of varying different minority parties that were struggling to form a cohesive bloc to actually govern the country. It definitely wasn't good. And the latest one that is in charge of that is the Labour Party here under this guy, Johan. And it's not doing great. Technically speaking, he builds up things within Norway economically, which is nice, but it is at the cost of drastically reducing Norway's military capabilities. And they don't really try to fix this until the late 1930s, almost right before Germany invades in the first place, which is a bit of an issue. We could go with an alternate history scenario in which, oh, what if Norway had actually managed to resist the Germans and continue down their historical path? Which is its own fascinating alternate history because technically speaking, anything is possible, it could have happened, but the downside within the focus tree of doing that is that this only factors in for joining the Allies, not the Nordic Council. If you want the Nordic Council, you have to completely do something different and potentially get very spicy. So that's what we're going to be doing here today, my friends. Our first choice in the matter of politics, a vote of no confidence. Can we trust a name that I'm not going to try to pronounce because potentially it's going to sound like something else that I could get in trouble for here on YouTube, and his Labor Party to keep the Bolsheviks and the Nazis at bay? This disarmament of his feels more like a Greek opening the doors of Troy than a prime minister ready to defend his land from communism. We cannot let them cede our fledgling nation to the Soviet Union. Yes, though in this case, it's more about the Germans than the Soviets, but it's still something that is going to end up factoring. Really, the way that we can explain that is that Johann's government here was made of a collaboration between his Labor Party and the agrarians. So we could easily say that the agrarian alliance fell apart, and it's something that caused a vote of confidence to take place. We could also say that maybe in the preceding months that actually the government that he tried to form was even smaller, had even less support than what it otherwise did, and that the opponent's party, the Liberal Conservative Alliance, that it gains significantly more authority. Obviously, when talking about an election, we can simply say, yeah, okay, they got more votes. That happened. As for why that is the case, well, we're not really going to change anything about Norway economically. Usually in some games, we would go and give more industry or something to them, but we can't really say that that is what happens here. The government of Johan has already been in charge, and the armed forces are completely obsolete. The hard 30s have completely wrecked the economy of Norway, and the cabinet doesn't really care about doing anything. It's just more so about maintaining peace and stability versus actual preparation. No confident vote against Johan. Despite its early promise, it seems the government that this guy formed last year was not only failing to deliver, but was also hell-bent on disarming. Many members of parliament believe that Norway should develop its industry in a way that allows for investing in the fledgling Norwegian armed forces with the intent of deterring a foreign power from invading. And so a vote of no confidence was triggered by members of the Conservative Party, Hoi4, or however you pronounce that. Though its chairman, the industrialist Johan H. Andersen, was already thinking about retiring, he seized the opportunity to lead Norway in a new direction, presenting himself as the pragmatic and efficient alternative to that guy's social progress dreams. Yeah, so now Andersen is the guy who's in charge, which is going to absolutely wreck our stability, but it is going to increase our overall strength. And here's why. It would be ludicrous to assume that the Nordic Council forms immediately in 1936. That is not going to happen. The first thing that has to happen is that Norway has to actually fix itself, fix its infrastructure, fix its crumbling fortifications, fix its broken and backwards economy, fix its obsolete armed forces. It has to be in a stronger position for the varying different Nordic countries to feel as though it would actually be able to protect itself and to unite behind it to be able to defend their interests. To that end, we will say a couple things happen early. First off, the Liberal Conservative Alliance that will then govern the country is much stronger. It does significantly better in the polls, it gains more authority, and so all these varying different minority governments that have been ruling Norway for the previous 20 years, that's not this situation. Instead, what happens is that they gain an outright majority. Maybe it's a small majority, but they do get one which allows them to govern effectively without having to make nearly as many compromises as what previous governments would have had to. And at the same time, on the industrial side, more effort and investment is given to Norway's navy, or I should say to its merchant fleet, which is something that is specifically used in order to be able to boost up native industry, as well as increase economic trade power. Is it going to be a major investment in the military from the very get-go? No, it's not. Norway still needs an industry, and to that, it has to first expand its dockyards, followed by expanding the merchant marine. Modern warfare needs resources and equipment, two things that Norway is desperately lacking. As war looms, we must be certain we have enough ships to bring all we need to survive. Yes, we already have more civilian ships than most nations, but we expect to lose many of them along the way, and we can't afford to be cut short. At the same time that all this is happening, rather than preparations beginning in the late 1930s, like maybe 1938 or even 1939, preparations for potential conflict and building up begin in 1936. The government is certain that our enemies will strike at any minute now. We must be resolute in our zeal to arm the population of Norway in order to prevent an invasion, even if it means attacking preemptively. So let us rally our country and take the power we need to decisively win against our enemies. At the same time that Norway is rapidly building up its merchant marines, we can also simultaneously say that the state receives a larger boost in the sense of foreign investment than it otherwise would have. Through more investment coming into the country, more industry is able to be kickstarted, and it doesn't have to be necessarily massive, but Norway is a very small country, so even a small amount of investment can go a pretty long way. With that, the storm will prepare to be weathered. Despite our previous attempts at improving the welfare of our people, we must now face the reality of rising threats from all around. We must start making preparations for the storm that is rising across all of Europe. All that we have built will be for nothing if we cannot defend it. As this is happening, assuming that the government actually has greater degrees of support in this time than it did in our own, then theoretically things are going to be able to be done faster. After decades of instability and inaction, it is understandable that the general population have no trust in our parliament, distorting. Without public trust, we will not be able to push through the measures we need to bring our country to stability. We can assume that no, but through somehow getting more votes, that the country is more stabilized than it otherwise would have been. With this greater authority, the government is then able to crack down upon the unions, thus allowing for greater industrial capabilities and production, even if it means that people suffer a little bit more in the meantime. And at the same time, in order to make sure that support among the people remains relatively high, economic relief measures are necessary in order to be able to boost said support. As 1937 rolls around, the economy of Norway would theoretically, at this point, be stronger. And so, due to this, instead of being late 1938 or late 1939 even, rearming for defense takes place earlier. We may have misjudged the danger ahead. Our shores will not provide a protection against a determined foe, and we cannot blindly rely on our Nordic neighbors for being a buffer forever. We must now make up the time lost and rearm Norway to be more ready to be able to defend itself. With that, as rearmament is taking place, the final real step for Norway is to A, maintain internal stability by doing things such as containing the labor movement, as well as at the same time uprooting the secret army, which is, yeah, we're seeing the rise of very different fascist movements within the country. And then immediately after that is done, this allows for the political authorities within Norway to consolidate power and prepare for the coming storm. With the secret army uprooted, this means two things are able to take place. First off, Lake, who is the guy who's the head of Norway's armed forces, is able to be replaced with someone who's more competent, because this guy was a key component, I guess you could say, of the previous administration. That what ends up happening is that he helps with the disarmament of Norway by taking him out earlier in 1937, or I guess late 1937, maybe even beginning of 1938. This rapidly speeds up the process in which Norway is able to prepare itself. Christian Lake has been a tool of the Liberal Party since his appointment. He has pushed through numerous reductions to the army's capabilities and does not seem to have the skills or the will to lead Norway to victory. We will need someone who is ready to put the army at the forefront of life in Norway. As for who is actually going to replace him, well, there's multiple choices. You have Carl Gustav Fischer, which is more attack, Wilhelm von Tegen, which is more organization, which is something, or we have the safe option here, which gives us some training. What we can arguably say in this is that Norway takes a significantly more bold approach. With a bolder government with greater strength behind it, Carl Gustav Fischer is the guy who ends up taking charge. And oh boy, does he have a portrait! Under Karl, the army is able to be reformed. Years of neglect at the hands of Christian Lake and the Liberal Party have left the army in what can only be called shambles. We must rebuild our military hierarchy, logistics, strategies, and protocols so they are up to par with the modern armies that we will likely face. Now, naturally, it's not like the Norwegian public is going to be super happy about what is going down. There is going to be a number of different stability issues that take place here. It's by focusing so much on rearmament and sacrificing what you'd have for civilian production, yes, the industry is going to boom, but some rights are going to be quashed, which is going to upset people. This means that stability is going to be a little bit harder to come by. But perhaps through uniting behind the government in the face of potential German aggression, this is something that keeps the people happier. You need to remember that as 1938 rolls around, this is where the Anschluss of Austria takes place, the Sudetenland crisis, etc. So, theoretically, if Norway had taken a stronger stance against this, and the people had seen what was going down, they wouldn't have been as against military preparation. We are able to maintain stability by virtue of just pumping out advisors, which I realized over the course of doing this video that is something that you need to maintain if you're just doing a regular playthrough of Norway. The stupid system that it has on the side where you lose one stability a week while doing a thing of preparedness, and you only have one option to gain one stability per week from what you're doing for economic relief measures is stupid. It is incredibly stupid. You will thus, from that, never be able to actually have a high degree of stability. You can only maintain this through, well, using your advisors. However, if your base stability is 0, it doesn't matter if you're losing one a week. It literally won't change anything, so you might as well just completely wreck your country and let the stability pan out. From here, my friends, as the middle of 1938 rolls around, it is that two crucial decisions are going to be made. The first is that an intelligence agency is actually going to be invested in. When Germany went and invaded Norway in our own time, Norway got barely any warning. In fact, it was almost accidental that they got any warning whatsoever, and by then it was way too late. Theoretically, in the event that Norway has stronger intelligence capabilities, it is likely able to detect the actions of Germany earlier, much earlier, potentially days or weeks or even months before it actually happens. And so, by the end of 1938, really heading into 1939, with a much stronger industrial military base, Norway is able to rapidly modernize its armed forces. This is something that happens over here, which we can select, thus removing the obsolete armed forces, and at the same time that the forces are no longer considered obsolete, they are simultaneously expanded. Our current land forces pale in comparison to other armies in the continent. Norway has simply never been a militaristic nation. Well, after the Vikings. As the threat of global power war grows, we must make sure our population is ready to defend our young nation. It is really only here, heading into the spring of 1939, that Norway will potentially now be able to go and form the Nordic Council, which, yes, this whole thing is marked in a more offensive way, but really, it means that as Norway rapidly modernizes its military, Sweden would have been tacitly supporting this, even as it was struggling to support its own people and industry and boost things up. Now, does this mean that Norway goes and launches a strike to attack Sweden and whatnot? No, absolutely it does not. That would not make sense to take place. I mean, really, one of the big problems is that even if Norway goes and creates the Nordic Council, if they do this, it doesn't mean that the other entities are also going to join in. Sweden, Finland, Denmark, etc. We don't really see that. Until finally, things get really spicy. As Germany has gone and invaded Poland and the Soviets go after Finland, you can expect that the varying Nordic countries would start to get extremely agitated at this point. Would Norway have the military forces to potentially spare for Finland? Yes, technically speaking, sure, but they're not going to send over volunteers. They're not going to do this because, well, they can't really spare it. They see potentially what is coming to the south, and with the new spy agency that they would have had, potentially reports could come in about possible German plans for an invasion much earlier than, actually I say earlier, they didn't really get any warning. Like literally just a couple hours. In this case though, they know that it's coming. The German Reich has clear strategic interests in Scandinavia, both for bases of military operation and for the sake of natural resource import. The escalating conflict has meant that there is a very real threat to any resources ferried through the Baltic or the North Sea, with gradually intensifying diplomatic threats against Denmark and Norway. An increase in German military operations in the region seems likely. Yes, this happens, and more importantly, Norway is aware that it is going down. Perhaps Denmark is given a little bit more warning, but it doesn't really matter, per se, as it's going to get very swiftly and easily conquered. Now, historically, what had happened is that Norway fell somewhat rather quickly. We say somewhat because what would end up going down is that the Norwegians were outnumbered almost 2-1, but they were able to fight doggedly, defending all the way to the north before getting evacuated out. And the reason this happened is because, well, the situation on the continent ended up changing, where the British Expeditionary Force was completely routed, and all defensive efforts had to be maintained on protecting the island. So all the British forces that were spread around the varying places, like trying to protect things in Norway, yeah, those couldn't stick around anymore. Now, of course, the initial German invasion is going to be extremely scary. But in the event that the Norwegians are actually able to hold, this could have massive implications. With the failure of an initial invasion, this means that the Germans would be forced to possibly escalate their plans to try and take things out on the continent, driving deep into France. The same thing is going to happen as it did in our own time, and with British forces likely already stationed up in Norway, this is going to limit the amount of available troops that will be able to be sent down. However, with the collapse of France, it would make sense that the vital resources of Sweden would still need to be seized, so efforts would likely be redoubled to launch further invasions into Norway in order to be able to seize the routes necessary. Easily the most interesting thing that could take place in this time is that in the event that Norway actually manages to hold off the Germans, if it exposes a weakness within the Reich, then even with the success that they will have on the continent, they will be forced to trade more with the Soviets because Sweden, potentially emboldened, actually cuts off trade with the Germans. And with that, even though it may only be tacit approval at first and not actually fully joining in the war, Sweden may sign a defensive agreement with the Nordic Council and may join as its second founding member. Mustache Man would likely redouble his efforts to take out the Norwegians, but if they are able to hold, then the effects of this would be truly massive. Multiple divisions of German forces would be lost. The initial invasion force they launched was around 100,000 men, and then with that potentially being stranded up in Norway with potential destruction of the fleet, means that they're not able to extract those men, and that is huge casualties to suffer, especially in the beginning of the war. By August of 1940, considering the multiple invasions that the Germans would have tried to launch, that 100,000 men that I talked about in this case is 150,000. That is a huge loss for the Axis to face. Not only that, but it means that the position of Norway is able to be reinforced. With it being reinforced, with Sweden actually joining in on the Nordic Council in a defensive alliance and cutting off trade with Germany, this means that the steel that would have been fueling the German Reich and its war machine comes not necessarily to a grinding halt immediately, but it is kicked into crisis in the same way that the lack of fuel later on would also prove to be a major point in crisis. As the German Reich begins to suffer from lack of resources, it launches strikes into further locations, such as Greece and more, in order to be able to try and secure as many resources as it can. As 1940 turns into 1941, the German Reich would be in a much weaker position. Without the resources to be able to produce more equipment, it means that less aid is able to be provided to Italy, which means that it will begin to suffer massive complications down in Africa at a much faster rate than it did in our own time. Chances are, with Norway still not taken and the line for supplies for Sweden not secured, Operation Barbarossa is potentially delayed in this time, as all efforts are made to strike into Norway. But thanks to a unified effort, with although Sweden probably doesn't join in on the war per se immediately, it does send over large numbers of volunteers, which are disguised as Norwegians, in order to be able to maintain a degree of neutrality, even if it doesn't actually exist. Hello, valuable German Panzer Division. Yeah, that's not gonna last. Yeah, the strategy they were using here is basically to try to bully the Germans as much as possible, which in an actual game, if you were playing Norway, and we're not just going to do an alternate history or whatever, yeah, the strategy of basically baiting the Germans into coming in and then ambushing them repeatedly is a way to drastically reduce down their numbers. If you go and look over here, they have managed to lose 748,000, with 431,000 of that being just to Norway, which is kind of broken versus our 12,000 losses. Oh dear God, are they throwing every German Panzer Division in here? What the heck? Eventually, the destruction may be so bad that Sweden itself finally does fully join in on the conflict. Of course, the Germans would not have had access to the resources at this point for over a year, which means it would be in a much rougher position than it was in our own time. Here, you can see that they've lost over 1 million casualties already. In 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union has not even taken place, so they would be desperately trying to recruit as many men as they could. Now, does this mean that the Mustache Man would put off his invasions for the Soviet Union and not do it? Maybe there is a good chance of that, or theoretically, thinking that the Soviets would be weak, he would still push for an invasion. After all, everything else had remarkably succeeded. We can assume that this actually takes place if, for example, Italy, though it has a very bad time down in Africa, is able to take out Greece on its own and Germany does not have to get involved. By that logic, yeah, Germany has gone and launched a strike onto the Soviet Union. That has happened, and at the same time that does, Sweden has launched its own little strikes into German territory in order to be able to weaken the potential blow of said invasion. Dear Lord, the Swedes keep on throwing away their men here, and I'm not sure why they have thrown away so many men against Germany. Why? Why would you do such a thing? Now, even with significantly reduced men, the Soviet Union was in a horrible position, arguably, from 1941. They really were. And the forces that they had here were definitely going to still be surrounded and killed in large numbers. However, it's not going to occur to nearly the same degree. And with much less men on the front line for Barbarossa, it means more Soviet forces are actually able to escape, withdrawing further back and creating a stronger defensive line, meaning the Germans do not advance nearly as fast. Because of this, even though the Germans make some gains heading into winter of 1941, at a time where they were almost outside the gates of Moscow itself, it seems before, no, they are far, far, far from this, and the casualties just continue to mount. One of the crazy things is that as 1941 heads into 1942, the Germans are going to start rapidly losing a lot of their subs, with one of the key reasons being that, okay, well, Norway was taken to use a lot of its fjords for U-boat bases. Like that's one of the key reasons that it was taken. It was so useful to be able to launch strikes on the rest of the Atlantic from Norway. With that being gone, instead, there won't really be any safe places for the varying different U-boats to refuel, rearm, etc., and they will begin to drop like flies, meaning the UK will be under significantly less pressure. The truly crazy part is that because the Soviets were never really pushed all that far back, it means that in their counterattack, they are able to make sweeping gains into Germany, which is not able to actually be capitalized upon by the United Kingdom or the United States, because yes, they will have military forces, and yes, the UK will not have taken nearly as bad of losses, but they wouldn't have had the year's worth of preparation to build up said forces for launching their own counterstrikes. The counter invasion into Italy has not taken place. Germany is more focused upon because it is still seen as weak. Eventually, losses may be so great that the Danish government in exile is able to actually come back to a degree, and launched by a joint effort of Norway and Sweden, the northern tip of Jutland is able to be seized, potentially cutting off the German advance. Even as German forces try to maintain ground, they're struggling to deal with the Soviets. So it is by the end of 1942 that Denmark itself is freed, as the Germans are no longer able to maintain their positions within the area. Now, considering manpower issues, it kind of would be impossible for Sweden and Norway collectively to be able to push just straight into Germany. That is not going to happen. However, by creating a kind of beachhead here on the northern front, which would allow for Allied forces to begin to pour in, this is something that would greatly begin to weaken the Reich and allow the Norwegians and Swedes to consolidate their position. This means that D-Day is able to be launched a year and a half early. As the Russians are sweeping in through the east, desperately the Allies try to make some grounds by pushing in from the north as well as the west. Simultaneously, with so few defenders able to stop the advance of the Allies, Italy will collapse into civil war. Now, because of the significantly weakened German position, and because the Allies were able to move in through the Scandinavian territory, or territory that the Scandinavians took, this means that the Allies are going to end up being in a much stronger position because the Soviets are not able to sweep through the entirety of Europe, take Berlin, and more. By striking from the north, it allows for greater democratic control over the region. So it is, my friends, by the late 1943, the entirety of the German Reich collapses. We need to understand is that without being able to get the precious resources of steel that were needed out of Sweden, the Germans are in a much worse position. In fact, we could have arguably said that instead of 1943, it would have potentially collapsed in 1942, almost immediately after any potential invasion of the Soviet Union, as the amount of equipment that they would have lost would have drastically increased in comparison to previous years. As for how divisions are going to work, this is where things are going to get very interesting. Because yes, the Yalta Conference is still going to take place, and the whole thing for the spheres of influence are going to be divided up. However, the Soviets would have not made it nearly as far into Germany as they did in our own time. They wouldn't have Berlin. In fact, it would be the Norwegians and Swedes, even with their much smaller industry and base, that would have actually taken this likely, which means that they would be able to at least get some kind of degrees of influence to the north. Now, because it is that we were using a mod in order to be able to actually control the peace deals to set the future that should have happened in the scenario that we have built, it's not going to look exact. Instead of puppet states being set up or collaboration governments, it is, of course, direct ownership. And this is how that sphere of influence would kind of be carved up. The Soviet Union would, of course, have the East as well as parts of Germany, but less of Germany than they did in our own time. Still, they would take pretty much the entirety of the Balkans, except for Yugoslavia, which would be independent, having been able to actually fight back against the Germans due to the fact that, well, the Germans were not as strong in this time. The Italians would have also lost significantly more troops. Norway and Sweden would get some small parts here of Germany, and simultaneously, what would end up happening is that Denmark would be placed under protective status, controlled by a mixed joint effort of Sweden and Norway, until it is that the Danish government could be reinstalled. With that, the war over 2 years earlier than it was in our own time, and with significantly less losses on part of the Allies, but just as much industrial boom, means that the post-World War II era, before nuclear weapons are used, is looking remarkably good for Europe. In fact, the Soviets will have lost significantly less men than they did in our own time. I think at one point they lost 20% of the entire population? Without such losses, this means that the Soviet Union in the aftermath is going to be a significantly more powerful state, a much greater threat to the West than it had been in our time. Yes, the West would have suffered less in the way of casualties, but the Soviet juggernaut would truly be the big and terrifying creature that would be coming next. And after the West having been secured, that means it is able to focus to the east. Japan will have been largely driven out of China, and the United States and the Soviet Union likely launch a joint strike into Japan from both sides, eliminating it as well. This probably occurring before nuclear weapons are ever utilized. With that, my friends, we're going to go ahead and end things here today. I think this was actually a fascinating scenario, and it really is crazy to think of what would have actually happened if Norway had been able to resist, if the Germans had never been able to secure their iron supply. That cuts down the war in a way that one can really only try to imagine. Either way, give your suggestions for next time. We will tackle that in another video. And my friends, thank you all very much for watching. Goodbye, everyone.